Right, Gary, loads of things we could pick up on. I think actually very, very sort of from a UK perspective, I mean, Keir Starmer will be listening to that interview and like punching the air.
I think that's right, you know. I mean, there's sort of little quip about him, despite him being a liberal. I think he can probably swallow that one. Also, this sort of potential row that some people have tried to stir up about Parliament, being recalled and whether it should. So, he's just not bothered about it, is he? So that's another little tick box that they don't need to worry about. Brexit, of course, didn't happen under Keir Starmer. So the sloppiness there can be brushed off. And I think the interesting thing, when I was really interested to ask him about the sort of flattery thing that in some ways Keir Starmer started when he came to Washington earlier in the year, and other leaders have picked up on, the bending of the knee, and in some cases, I'm not suggesting this in the case of the Prime Minister, but the bending of the knee so far that they're practically on the floor. I wonder whether, Donald Trump, whether he likes it or whether he's trying to, and he was just kind of either just trying to be nice. In other words, he knows it. He knows it for what it is, and he's prepared to just see through it. So I think, that is something that I was curious about. And the trade deal, or the trade deal he claims that has taken place with the UK, of course, lots of disputes about how broad and how in place all that is something I think is down to the chemistry and indeed down to the president's, absolutely apparent affection, I think, for the UK. You could put it like that. I mean, sure, we got the adverts for all the properties and the golf courses, and we know some of his ancestors are from Scotland, obviously, but there is an affection there, and that translates into, in some ways, I think, into the political.
Just on a little sidebar for the Brexit thing, I mean, we don't know if he thinks it was Theresa May or Boris Johnson who did Brexit in a sloppy way. But what is interesting is that he obviously thinks Keir Starmer.
One of my regrets. Yeah. One of my regrets that I didn't.
No, don't worry.
When you do these interviews, you always have regrets, don't you? And that is one of the ones that I thought, darn it, should have asked what you meant by that.
I mean, that's only like a little footnote. It's only a minor piece of feedback from my point of view, Gary. I think, but what's interesting is that he clearly thinks that Keir Starmer, by smoothing some of the edges of Boris Johnson's Brexit deal and getting the UK a bit closer to the EU, he's obviously in favour of that. So while Donald Trump is a Brexiteer, he's not like a maximise sovereignty, like minimise the relationship between the UK and the EU kind of Brexiteer. He's a kind of soft Brexiteer, but that's quite minor in the grand scheme of what we're talking about today. Also, it was interesting. Yeah, you're talking about you put those things about, does he want to address the Houses of Parliament? Is he annoyed about the King going to the Canadian Parliament? And he chose not to pick those fights, which shows you that he only picks the fights he wants to. He doesn't just automatically walk into every fight that's offered to him.
That's right. I mean, I don't know, on the question of Parliament, whether he has a different view. That's the view I have. I had heard that, not him specifically, but I had heard some disquiet, potentially, among the diplomatic community and perhaps in the administration as well, about the King's opening of the Canadian Parliament. Nothing had really ever been made public. So I wanted to slightly explore that, because, as you know, Donald Trump has made this a big thing about, Canada being the 51st state and all this kind of stuff that the Canadians get very upset about, as you can imagine. And I just wanted to see whether it was the case, but he didn't seem to go for that in any way, and seemed to be sort of resigned to the idea. Well, what else could King Charles do?
Yeah, and also there's a clear personal affection there. So and also because he's quite. For somebody who is sometimes accused of being a bull in a china shop, at times he can be very, very polite and very kind of formal and very, in fact, quite solicitous himself.
Yeah, he is. And he's someone who thrives on personal contacts. It's why he finds it, I think, perplexing. And this is something I think I detected in his words during that interview, perplexing that simply getting people together when there's a problem with him there, he finds it a bit baffling, I think, that doesn't sort it out. And so the chemistry is incredibly important from his point of view. I think the chemistry was the start of the real problem, if you remember, with Vladimir Zelensky at the beginning of the year. I mean, he even took exception to President Zelensky, what he was wearing right from the get-go, if you remember. And I think that is something that is absolutely central to his modus operandi. Now, he's not the only politician who does that. Some of the greatest politicians of the era have been extraordinary people. They are people that relate to people incredibly well. If you think of Clinton, in a room, the way Clinton used to work a room, it was extraordinary to see him working a room. And people will say Tony Blair was the same in some ways. And Donald Trump is very different to those characters, but it is that sort of personal chemistry that he thrives off. And for him, if you get elected twice as president, you think you're doing something right.
And somewhere where the chemistry is definitely on the decline is his relationship with Vladimir Putin. And so we got hints of this in the Oval Office earlier on Monday, where Trump had been sitting with Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, and he started to sound really quite critical of Russia, and certainly much more critical than he has done in the past. And with you, he was even more critical of Putin.
Yeah, I mean, he's said some pretty straightforward and colourful things about Putin in recent weeks, more so than I got out of him. And he's been very irritated. I think, he talks about lots of nice words, and then in the evening, Vladimir Putin goes and bombs people and bombs nursing homes, I think he puts it. So that has been an change. Now, it is also worth saying that Donald Trump can change his mind pretty quickly, can change his mind in a way that you feel a bit bewildered by sometimes at the speed of it and the alacrity in which he can do a 180. But this has been a sort of process over time. He said, didn't he, that he thought he'd had a deal 4 times with Putin, and none of them had come home, and yet there's still this 50-day sort of window offering Putin another chance before the secondary sanctions kick in. So he still thinks there's an opportunity for a deal. And that's why when I said to him in that sort of, I mean, it's an American question, isn't it? Are you done with? A particularly American kind of phrase that, you know exactly what it means if you live in America. And he said, no, I'm not done. I'm just disappointed, which means the door is still ajar.
And also just that moment, I mean, it's so theatrical when you say, do you trust him? And there's that massive pause that you could drive one of those big and massive American trucks through. And he says that he doesn't really trust anyone, which actually when you hear it in this context, sounds a little bit tragic, actually.
Well, I mean, the pause was one thing. I mean, I waited, and the temptation can be to sort of leap in. But I could hear he was still there, so I just waited. And then when he said, in a really sort of wistful, sort of slightly distant tone about trusting almost nobody, a sort of shiver went up my spine, actually, because I thought at that moment, that is an incredibly lonely place to be in this world, if you trust almost no one.
Although it maybe explains why he's got a somewhat sort of nihilistic view of the world. And why it's like, it's might is right, dog eat dog, actually don't really look after anyone.
Transactional, indeed.
Yeah. And also going back to the point about what he said about Putin, it's like, I mean, you don't need to be an expert or have been to Ukraine recently to know that for years the Russians have been attacking civilian targets. Like, that's not new news to anyone.
No, I mean, yeah. That's the other thing that people will say, and I think it's a fair criticism. We've been telling you this all along about Putin. That's what Vladimir Zelensky will say. The Europeans will say, we've been telling you all along that this is what Putin is like. And finally you've come around to the idea. And that, I think, is a fair criticism. He would answer, look, I'm just focused on stopping the bloodshed. And he said, and that there was no progress towards that in the years I was out of power. And he always says the war is Biden's war. It started under Joe Biden, not my war. And he will come back to this point that he will do or try and do what's necessary to end the bloodshed. It's the thing he's focused on. I mean, he quotes a lot of numbers that are disputed about people who are dying, but unquestionably there is a huge amount of misery on both sides, and on the civilian, particularly the civilian casualties in Ukraine as well. And I think that would be his justification for just keeping that line of communication open, and at least not, up until now at any rate, not completely sort of closing down the possibility for some sort of communication with the Russian leader.
And Gary, let's end our conversation where you started your conversation with President Trump about the shooting a year ago. He was actually really reticent to talk about it. I mean, that's kind of the opposite of the kind of fight them imagery that emerged of him at the time.
Yeah, it's interesting. I thought that he really didn't want to go there. And, he said that he got up at the time because he needed to show the crowd something. And that's pretty plausible to me, and that's why he refused the stretcher and everything, and refused to be carried off. But he didn't. He seemed very reluctant to want to go there, and it was difficult to exactly discern the meaning of his words. But I got the distinct impression that, if he started to think about it, he might not be able to stop thinking about it and stop thinking about the possibility. So the positive thing to do, as he put it, the power of positive thinking, is to not think about it at all. That's the stronger thing to do. And so while he knew that the anniversary was going to bring this all around and there were going to be questions that he couldn't avoid, I think if you asked him today or tomorrow, he'll be pretty glad that anniversary's passed.
Yeah, and he's given us a great new Trumpism, which is the power of positive non-thinking, which is a new one on all of us. Gary, thanks very much for your time today, and congrats on such a good interview.
Thanks, Adam. Nice to see you.
So I've got two thoughts about that, having listened to it about 5 times today. Number one,